So we're going to set up a time to walk around the gardens and let's look at the history of, amazing history, the hidden history of Jewish Oxford. Pardon?
Yes, so you must have read the leaflet then. Hidden history.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah. So
Is it free?
for you, we'll see.
Just asking.
I'll do a special deal.
That's a Jewish question.
Fair question.
We're going to talk about it.
No stereotypes
Yeah,
there.
there's a lot of work to do.
Very purposefully chosen. I mean, I think it's thematic.
Yeah, no. So when would you want to do it?
Well, you're the organizer, so
In the evening, like at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, or you want to do it Saturday, Sunday, Saturday? Okay, we'll come up with a time, and we'll let you know within the next 24 hours. We'll set a time.
yeah, it might be better early evening perhaps, in terms of the available time.
Yeah.
When it is not raining.
Yeah, it's not raining. It's just, I don't do swimming tours. It's possible I could do it on a Saturday or Sunday, but I'll probably go off to France next week.
All right. So we'll work out a time, and we'll organize something. All right. So we have the great distinction and honor to have Dan Michman with us. Dan is a professor of Holocaust studies. He was the director of Yad Vashem Research, which Yad Vashem is a preeminent Holocaust Memorial Museum in the world. He was the head of research there. And he's a professor emeritus of Jewish history and the chair of the Arnold and Leona Finkler Institute of Holocaust Research, and is the Abraham and Adita Spiegel Family Chair in Holocaust Research at Bar Ilan. Dan is really a preeminent expert on aspects of the Holocaust and the Holocaust history, and also on commenting on issues of Holocaust studies and how things are shifting in the sort of postmodern world. So today, Dan is going to speak on when and why was the term anti-Semitism coined, and why did it become a central phenomenon in modern Europe? Is the term still useful for scholarly research?
You changed the topic from when
Okay.
that was
I know what I'm
scheduled.
saying.
I saw that it was the schedule for today, but I can change.
No, you're right. I messed it up. This is the correct title. Excuse me. I was just testing if you're
It had to be yesterday, but I just came in yesterday.
So Dan, thank you
this
for
morning.
being here.
Thank you very much, and I'm very glad to be here again. After several times, we are following it now for 10 years. What is it? From the first time, and every time another college, which is nice. So what I was asked to do here in this talk is a tour de force. So that is an overview of major developments in Holocaust research in the past 3 decades, or even a little bit more, and how it changed our view. And when I say our, that's the historians' view. But I thought that I would like to begin with the terminology, which is, I think, also important. I personally started my studies in linguistics, Semitic linguistics, Hebrew, and so on. I started my study 3 days after I finished my military service, and the classes that I entered was about Ge'ez, which is Old Amharic, that is the Ethiopian language, and there were three students, and the teacher or the professor said, well, the basics are the same as in Arabic, just study the alphabet for the next week and we will start reading. Now, in those of you who know Amharic, they know that there are 164 letters in the alphabet. So I quitted Semitic linguistics, or partially, and shifted to history. But my interest in linguistics remained, and I would say that part of my approach to history is looking at the semantics of terms and the evolution of concepts and terms, what we call in history of terminology. I think it's very important. For instance, if we talk about the Holocaust, there is a well-known speech by the leader of the Zionist revisionist movement, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, Vladimir Jabotinsky, when he established the new Zionist organization, which left the general Zionist organization in 1935, and there he speaks about annihilation. And it was his speech was published in German at the time. That was the leading language in the Zionist congresses, and the term is Vernichtung, annihilation. Annihilation in 1935 is not what annihilation in 1941 was, or 1939. So within several years, things happened that changed the meaning of the word, and I think that is something that that we always have to pay attention to. And for me, it's fascinating to see what happened now. What we do today when we relate to the Nazi anti-Jewish enterprise, as I would call it, are the terms Holocaust and Shoah. I'll come back to them in a moment, but when we and how they emerge, but when we look at the publications and discourse of survivors, of Holocaust survivors, and I'll use the term Holocaust, but the survivors in the already during the period itself, but in the immediate post-war period until the 1970s, we see a lot of terms that were used. And okay, I have to move forward. You will see there are one that was often used in Yiddish is Churban, which is the Hebrew Churban, destruction. And for those of you who know Raoul Hilberg's book, The Destruction of the European Jews, can understand that he used a term that he had taken over from his PhD supervisor, Philip Friedman, who was a survivor, and used this term in various of his various publications. Then there is catastrophe. You can find it in Ladino, in Yiddish, in other languages, and its equivalents: disaster, calamity. Another term that is used by survivors is cataclysm or Nazi cataclysm. Then we have extinction, which is in Yiddish umkum, and in Hebrew kilayon. A term that was used mainly in religious writings, and that is until today in Hasidic publications. Days of wrath, that is in Hebrew Yemei HaZa'am or Tkufat HaZa'am, and so on. And then there is extermination, which in Yiddish is Vernichtung, and that is the Vernichtung in the German Vernichtung. And you have Schite or Schites, that is, for instance, used by Avram Sutzkever, the well-known Yiddish poet and writer, who was the only person who testified in the Nuremberg trials by the Soviet Party. Stalin had sent a special airplane to pick him out of the forest where he fled from Vilna. And Schite means slaughter. Then you have Untergang or Ondergang in Dutch, which means downfall. There is the Hitler-Tkufe, which is the Hitler period. So we have a lot of terms that were used by the survivors. So how come that we use the terms Holocaust and Shoah? And there are various scholars who try to understand and why, but it has a history of the way things are used in discourse. Now the term Shoah or the word Shoah is biblical and means a catastrophe an unforeseen, sudden catastrophe, and it is used in not only in the Bible but also afterwards in many writings, and it was also revived in the new revived Hebrew language since the end of the 19th century in Palestine. And for instance, there's a very interesting example that I found from 1932 in a newspaper where it says the Shoah of the water provision for the city of Jerusalem. So there is a catastrophe, there isn't enough water for Jerusalem, and the term Shoah is used. Now, from the very beginning of the ascendance of the Nazis to power in 1933, we see in the Hebrew discourse in the Jewish community in Palestine the word Shoah used. It is in 1933, 1934, 1994, about relating to what is happening in Europe, first in Germany, and then later on, after the annexation of Austria in 1938, also Austria, and so on and so forth. So what happened is that you have the same term, a term that was not newly coined, but was used. What happened is that the news that was pouring in from Europe actually made this term more and more loaded. And what happened in 1945 is, after the end of World War II, people said, the Shoah, right? It is so loaded, you shouldn't use it for other things. And then it is in a way sanctified and then introduced in legislation for Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel, for Yad Vashem in 1953, and so on. So this is the term that is used in the Hebrew discourse in Palestine. When does it spread? Since the 1980s, after, you will all know, I think, Claude Lanzmann's film of 1985, Shoah, and he chose the word Shoah because he said, and it's in his memoir, because nobody understands what it means, right? Outside Israel. Right? So I take a term in order to show that it is incomprehensible. So that is why we have the term Shoah, and why it was promoted through Claude Lanzmann in the mid 1980s, and then taken over in French, and it becomes the leading term in French. So now you have the equivalent of Yad Vashem in Paris is Mémorial de la Shoah. Right? And they have a publication, Revue d'Histoire de la Shoah. And so Shoah is the term that is used first then in French, and then is taken over also to other languages. And the term Holocaust, which is a Greek word, means originally a sacrifice to the gods, and was used in the Septuagint. Yoel Kotick was looking for the word for the Greek translation of the Bible, the Septuagint. Right there's it used for a for a totally burned sacrifice, and so it's also in the Latin translation, the Vulgata, and so on. But since the 16th century, the word is used also in a secular meaning entirely, for shipwrecks, for forest fires, and so on and so forth. And we can see it throughout. There's a very interesting article that you could find online by a person whose name is John Petrie, and Petri. You can easily find it, and he checked it in English since the 16th century. And it is used for all kind of things, also during World War II, but also during World War I, for instance, for the Armenian genocide. And it's here and there used also by Jews, but it isn't the leading term. It becomes the leading term, and I don't know if you use this search engine Ngram. You know what it is, Ngram? Yes. No? So at my age, I have to teach you search engines. It's N gram, and you can open it and you can enter a word, and and it is all the books that were scanned by Google since which were published since 1800, and then you can get the results of how often it is used, right? And then you'll see that around 1960, it peaks. So around 1960, something happens. And what happened is, on the one hand, the capture of Eichmann, and afterwards the Eichmann trial. And in the Eichmann trial, the Holocaust was presented as something separate and special, and not like in the Nuremberg trials, right? On the other hand, we have the the English translation of Elie Wiesel's Night. Some of you have read it, and it has a preface, and the preface was written by the French Catholic intellectual François Mauriac, and he uses the term Holocaust with a lowercase h, right? Not a, but when he describes Elie Wiesel's experiences during the Holocaust. And then you can see that during the Eichmann trial, the reporters needed a term that can be used, and then you suddenly see the term peaking, right? And then it is promoted in 1978 by the American TV series Holocaust, which is very kitschy, but had an enormous impact. And then the term spreads all over, and then people are using also for other things, animal Holocaust, whatever, and so on. So these are the two terms that conquer the area. There is a proposal in 1988 by the historian himself, a Luxembourg-born Jew, Arno Meyer. He was a Princeton professor of history, and he proposes Judeocide, right? The murder of the Jews, and it is hardly accepted, and I think rightly so, which I'll show afterwards. By the way, his book was a bestseller when it was published. Why Did the Heavens Not Darken? Nobody is using the book anymore. If you are a full professor at Princeton, you don't have to use footnotes. So there are no footnotes in his book. You don't have to prove it, right? And there are a lot of things that are very weird, but at the time it was a bestseller. But the question is, what does it mean, Shoah? And so first of all, the terms that remained are the terms that developed in the Hebrew discourse and the English and French discourse, right? And that is mainly the English discourse, but that is because that is the countries or the areas where which became the main centers of the Jewish world after the Holocaust. So the terms that were used in the local languages and also Yiddish started, well, not entirely disappear, but was less spoken by people because those who emigrated to Israel started to speak Hebrew, and those who to the English-speaking countries, English. So the terms of which are not the terms of the survivors became the leading terms. Right? And the second thing is that both terms don't tell you anything about what happened. Right? I like to say that if E.T. would come again on Earth, and you would ask, what is Holocaust? Right? He wouldn't understand what it means. Only if you know something, then you know to what it relates. So we have this weird situation that not the terms of the survivors are the leading terms, and that the terms themselves remain vague. Don't tell somebody who is ignorant about it what really happened. So this is a background, but this leaves open also the question of what should be included in the term. when we speak about the Holocaust, what do we relate to? And if you look through the to the literature, the historiography over time, you'll see that sometimes there are enormous discussions between scholars, and when you really try to analyze their understanding of the term, they speak about different things. They define the Holocaust in different ways, and then they are quarreling about the contents. Right? So this is just as a background and to keep in mind. If we look at the historiography itself, there is a lot of scholarship about the Holocaust which is not historical, which deals with religious aspects, with sociological and so on. But if we relate to historiography, I would say that we can discern 5 stages, main stages in this historiography. One is during the period itself, between 1933 and 1945. A lot was written. Of course, without having the perspective, the hindsight perspective of but things were written by scholars who provided overviews of what was happening in Germany for their governments in the free world and for Jewish organizations. And there are also scholars who are interested in what was happening. And there are Jews, for instance, in the Warsaw Ghetto. The Ringelblum Archives is known to many. It's called Oynek Shabbos, which was an underground archive, but they also wrote studies. So you have historiography of this period. The advantage of this period is that they had an immediate knowledge of what was going on. The disadvantage was that they didn't have a perspective. And they didn't know what in 1942, what would happen in 1944, of course, and so on. So this changes afterwards in the immediate post-war period. The second period, I would say, second stage is between 1945 and 1960, and that is influenced by the trials of the major war criminals, and on the other hand, by historiography of survivors, who emphasize their aspect. I won't go into the details. Then there is the 1960s. That is, since 1960 in the Eichmann trial and several developments in German historiography until the mid-1970s, and then the mid-1970s until 1990. So from 1990 onwards till today is what I would call the 5th period. There are people who would say you can also divide this in sub-periods, but I'll keep it this way. Why is 1990 so important? Because of the downfall of communism in Eastern Europe, right? And this leads to the opening of archives. Just to give a short insight, that is, in 1945, after the collapse of Nazi Germany, Berlin was divided between the 4 main allies, right? And the Americans took from their part in Berlin documentation to the United States, to an archive outside Washington, D.C., Alexandria. They returned it to in West Germany in 1960 with six container boats. That's only what they took from their part. The Soviets took from their part also to Moscow, ordered it and closed it. So there was no access. And there were many other archives in Eastern Europe that were opened, and the amount of the material that was suddenly accessible was at least equivalent to what was known before. So in a way, it was a restart and rethinking of what was happening. Also, the places in Eastern Europe where much of the executions were carried out were now accessible. For instance, Babi Yar. And what happened additionally since 1994 was that from the World Jewish Congress and from survivors in various countries, a demand emerged regarding compensation and also in dealing, coping with the past of the various countries in Europe. And a lot of inquiry committees were established, more than 30 in all over Europe for all, and not only for the countries themselves, but also for various corporations, economic corporations. And I myself participated in the inquiry committee of the well-known Empire of Liechtenstein, if you ever have heard about this country, which was very interesting. For 5 years we worked on a report, but a major report from the period is from Switzerland. That was raised around dormant accounts of people who had perished and so on. So there were a lot of inquiry committees, and some of them are existing until today, for instance. But also new historical approaches in the field of historiography emerge, that is linguistic, cultural, spatial, and more. So a lot of things happened around 1990 or immediately afterwards that had an enormous impact on what was produced in the field of historiography. I wrote an overview of this 2 years ago, and I asked the Yad Vashem Library to provide me with data about the amount of publications, and what I got is that between 2000 and 2020, the library received 78,000 books, right? And scholarly books between 2009 and 2021, close to 10,000 books, and that is not articles in periodicals, right? So the amount is enormous, and it is very difficult to follow it. And I tried to count the languages of original research on the Holocaust, and I came to the number 28. So in 28 languages, if not more. So a lot has been going on and is still going on. And the question is, what happened? What did this enormous output change in our views? And I must say, as an opening to this part, that in the public, a lot of perceptions on the Holocaust that were established, that were proposed in the early stages, in the 1940s and 1950s, are still existent. Right? So scholarship is much more advanced than what is commonly known. For instance, something that I think all are aware of it, that you constantly still hear that in the Wannsee conference in January 1942, the decision was taken on the final solution, which is entirely wrong. Even if you read the document itself, you'll see that it says that the decision was taken before. But you have many other things that are still there. So, well, one of the things that happened is a bridging of what in the in the professional jargon of Holocaust studies is called intentionalism and functionalism. I'll explain in a moment. It has to do with the intention and the decision-making process on the final solution. And the first school that emerged after 1945, and it has to do also with the trials, with the way that the trials of the major war criminals were conducted, is that there was an intention by the Nazis to murder the Jews from the outset. From the outset. And this goes back to what is called in Hitler's first political writing from September 1919, where he says, and that is, he still served in the army and he wrote a kind of report, and he uses there the term total removal of the Jews. In German, Entfernung der Juden überhaupt. What is total removal of the Jews? So the intentionalist actually made a jump from 1919 to 1941 and said, well, he said this in 1990, this is the result, right? And then pointing to several stations in the process. So you have 1919, then 1925 Mein Kampf, 1933 Hitler's ascents to power, 1935 the Nuremberg laws, 1938 Kristallnacht, 1939 invasion of Poland, 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, beginning of the final solution. Right? So this is a linear understanding, and so on. But after a while, a new school emerged, and that has been called by a British scholar. We are in Britain here, so there's a British Marxist scholar, Timothy Mason, in 1979. He coined these terms, intentionalist, and the other, the functionalist or structuralist, that there was no intention from the very beginning. It is a constant process of radicalization, but it went zigzag, right? As one scholar has called it, also an American scholar, Karl Schleus, the twisted road to Auschwitz. That is the book from 1970. And it was a result of competition within the Nazi bureaucracy, in the top and middle echelons of the Nazi bureaucracy. And this radicalized the process and ending up in a final solution, which was not intended in the beginning, right? And therefore, and here's another difference between the two schools, the intentionalist school put the emphasis on Hitler, and Hitler as being omnipotent, leading the process, right? All over, and the functionalists said, no, this happened in the bureaucracy because the different power centers in the bureaucracy were competing, and this radicalized the process, and the extremists, the SS, they in the end took over. But Hitler was not central in this process. One of the leading functionalists, Hans Mommsen, wrote in 1975 even that Hitler was a weak dictator. And the process was done. This was not a revisionist view as such, because from the moral point of view, what he said, there were many more people. It's not just Hitler who ordered and the others fulfilled his orders, but there were a lot of people who contributed to the process. And there were fierce debates between these two schools, and what changed now after 1990 is that the two schools could be brought together. Right? And one of the major persons who contributed to this was the British historian Ian Kershaw, who even got the term Sir because of his biography, or so-called biography of Hitler, and he introduced a term that he found in the documents, and that is working towards the Führer. So there was a vision by Hitler, but he didn't order everything. What happened is that a lot of people proposed things and thus worked towards the goals of the Führer. Right. And so here is a major change which started. I'll add to this later on something. Another thing is that because of the accessibility of new sources, especially in Eastern Europe, scholars went beyond the top and middle echelons of the bureaucracy. So it's not just the top, the ministers and the people surrounding Hitler and the upper echelon of the bureaucracy, even the middle echelon of the bureaucracy, but to the grassroots level. What happened on the ground all over, especially in Eastern Europe. And one of the well-known books studies is by Christopher Browning, Ordinary Man. There was a counter study by Daniel Goldhagen, and they quarreled a lot, but the Browning approach, I think, left a larger imprint, but they focused on what did people on the ground do, how did they carry out the ideas, did they initiate themselves things that they were not ordered to do from above, because it is not enough that a leader says something, it has to be carried out. And the fact that the anti-Jewish policies, and especially Final Solution, were so successful, depended on a lot of people who would do something and propose the means to implement it. I can say here in between that is, I talked about the stages, and we are talking now in 2023 about a period that lasted only for 12 years and 98 days. So it's a capsule in history, very short period, and yet it was an enormous outbreak, and which had an enormous impact afterwards. So the question of the input of the lower echelons became more and more important, and because now there was this emphasis on Eastern Europe, and a lot of scholars running to see what happened in Eastern Europe on the ground, it was found there were a lot of local initiatives that were not ordered from above, and this raised the question between the interaction between the center in Berlin, the top of the Third Reich, and the periphery, what is happening there, and not only in Eastern Europe, but mainly in Eastern Europe. And one of the results, maybe I'll add another thing, is that in this rush to find also in Eastern Europe, in the new archives, the written order for the final solution was never found. Right? So until the end of the Cold War, people expected perhaps somewhere a document would be found. But we know today that there was no written order. There was an oral directive, apparently. And that is one of the things that scholars tried to decipher. And the mainstream, there are still debates, but the mainstream says that it happened apparently in a meeting at Hitler's office on the 16th of July 1941, after the beginning of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Because there is no protocol of this meeting, but after this meeting, a lot of things happen. right? Himmler is the head of the SS and the police. He goes to Eastern Europe and visits several places. And from the second week of August 1941, the pattern of killings changes. Right? In the first weeks of the invasion of the Soviet Union, the killings are mostly of males. Since the second week, around the 7th of August, it suddenly changed, also women and children, and whole areas, and the peak is in Babi Yar at the end of September. So it changes. But it is in the Soviet Union, right? And then you see first steps in other places. And so the understanding today of the final solution is that it was not a decision taken before the invasion of the Soviet Union, but the invasion of the Soviet Union was viewed as an apocalyptic war. And with the first successes, Hitler accelerates his vision, and we start a process that is of broadening circles of killings. They start in the first males, then and women and children and whole areas, and then it broadens, and then later on comes in the meeting in Wannsee, which was not a conference, by the way, it was a meeting, and it's very important. Although it's impossible now to erase this expression. Everybody will say Wannsee conference, but I cling to Wannsee meeting. So in the meeting, this meeting is part of the broadening process, and where there is an attempt to coordinate between the different bureaucratic players to work on a better coordinated implementation of a murder of the whole of continental European Jewry. And that's the term also, European Jewry, that's the term in the Wannsee protocol. So, but we don't know exactly when the moment of decision was. Right? We only can guess. Which is a problem, of course. Historians want documents, right? As we know, the most important things, we don't write them down, right? It's orally, and it is part also of Hitler's way, of mode of conducting his policies. But this is a very important finding, I think, and therefore the way how this worked is still researched by many scholars. Moreover, because of this emphasis on Eastern Europe, research on Eastern Europe, it became clear that the extent of killings in Eastern Europe by shootings is about 2.5 million Jews. If we think about the iconic number of 6 million, which has its own history, but it's close to 6 million with what we know today, right? Then this had an impact in historiography, not so much in the public imagination, about the place of Auschwitz. Auschwitz has been formed in the Cold War period as the iconic representation of the Holocaust. Right? It's modern, it is industrial, right? And it's the major killing place. It was, I must say that Poland contributed to it, because for a long time the Poles claimed that some 4 million people were killed in Auschwitz. We know today that it is 1.1, which is enormous, but not 4 million, right? And therefore the question, to what extent the final solution as part of the Holocaust is modern, is a question, right? So it is a question for philosophers, for sociologists, and the interesting extremes can be shown that still in 1988, before the downfall of communism, we have the book by Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist, Polish-born, Jewish, and there he said modernity in the Holocaust, right? The Holocaust was modern, a product of modernity. And interestingly, in his book, he doesn't deal with what was even known at that time, the Einsatzgruppen, the killing squads in Eastern Europe, right? He only relates to the killing centers, the camps, and so on. Now, in 2010, Timothy Snyder, an American historian, published a book, Bloodlands, where he said it's entirely wrong to view the Holocaust via Auschwitz, right? It was a part of a larger campaign of murders, Stalin and Hitler and so on, but the main thing that happened was the brutal killings in Eastern Europe. Okay, Auschwitz was also there, but that is not the example to look through on the Holocaust. Now there was another conceptualization by the well-known Jewish scholar Raoul Hilberg. Raoul Hilberg was born to a Galician Jewish family living in Vienna, and they left after the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, in 1939, and he came to the United States and was mobilized towards the end of World War II into the American Army, and when the American Army conquered Bavaria and Munich and found the headquarters of the Nazi Party and also many more German documents, Hilberg was one of the persons who was ordered to analyze, analyze the documentation and so on, and then he embarked on a PhD at Columbia University, which he successfully defended in 1955, and then expanded the book, which was published in 1961. Now, Hilberg was supervised by Philip Friedman. I mentioned him before, was a Holocaust survivor, a historian himself, who also taught at Columbia University. But Hilberg was not an historian. Some of my best friends are not historians, but he was a political scientist, and it's very important because usually Hilberg is brought forth as a historian. As a political scientist, part of the social sciences, he tried to create a model of the Holocaust. And he actually established two deeply entrenched in the literature now models. One of the development of the anti-Jewish policies, and the other of the protagonists of the arena. It is very simple what he said about the development. There were stages. First, the Jews had to be defined. That happens in 1933, and again in 1935, that's the definition. A second stage was expropriation. A third, concentration, and he equates concentration with ghettoization, right? And the fourth stage was annihilation or extermination, which straddled into two directions, that is mobile killing units and killing centers. Now, research has shown that the model is very nice, but it is not accurate historically, right? There is expropriation and there are persecutions before definition. Ghettoization is not identical with concentration, and also ghettoization and the establishment of Jewish councils are different developments. And so was marking, and marking is, by the way, very interesting phenomenon because it is not unified all over Europe and North Africa. You have a lot of marking badges and bands and so on. And even, for instance, in Tunisia, a 5-star, not a 6-star badge, and so on and so forth, at different moments and so on. So that, and as you can see, this is on the one hand functional, but also intentional or linear, because it leads from the beginning, from the definition to the later period. There is, by the way, even an interesting clause in his book where he says, I hope to quote it correctly, where he said, when the first official signed the first document or order, the gates of Auschwitz were opened, right? So if there is a linear development, and as we know now, due to the functionalists and others, that is wrong. Also, he established another differentiation between perpetrators, victims, and bystanders. Right? Now we know today that a lot of bystanders were also perpetrators, and there were bystanders who were both perpetrators and rescuers. And and also perpetrators, there are various kinds of perpetrators, so the generalization is not so easy, and you cannot put them all in one camp. One of the interesting examples is Romania, who murdered its own Jews, right? Not upon the order of the Nazis, some 400,000 Jews. So also this model fell apart. On the other hand, one of the interesting developments in this period is that scholars of a new generation delved into the biographies of the perpetrators. I remember one of the leading scholars, Peter Longerich, who also taught here in Britain. He told me, I think it was in 1995, that when I read the studies by the functionalists, what I see is that, and again this is a linguistic aspect, that the Jews were deported, were murdered, and so on. Nobody is doing it. They were murdered. They were deported. Yeah, they were sent to. But who was doing it? Who was doing it? And you see a lot of names in these studies, but these are templates, just or titles, right? What happens now since the 1990s, that you have a lot of scholars, German scholars, and it's very interesting, delving into the biographies of these people, right? Before the ascendance of the Nazis to power, and after 1945. And one of the scandalous events was in 1997 in the annual meeting of the German Historical Association, where some of the rebellious younger historians organized a session showing that the first post-1945 supervisors of theses about Nazi Germany and the Holocaust were themselves involved in Nazi policies, right? Some of them changed their names, others did other things, and so on. So what they said, we have to look again on the first studies, in the post-war studies, what happened. Right? And also how a lot of these people, of the perpetrators, entered the post-war West German state structures. Right? And there are now a lot of studies about the German foreign ministry and also the judiciary and so on, where you can see that people who served in the Nazi period continue to serve afterwards, right? So the question of a clear as it was called, Punkt Null, that is 1945. The 8th of May 1945 is a kind of schism, right? There is before the Nazis, afterwards it's something different, right? This has to be changed. Now another aspect is the extent of local and Nazi-allied involvement, turning it into a European enterprise. And I talked before about the fact that the ordinary man, in the Nazi in the Nazi bureaucracy, but also in its other services, and Germans in general. But here it is, how many people all over Europe contributed to the process. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been possible. I mentioned already Romania. If you think that about 400,000 of the 6 million were murdered by the Romanians themselves, that is already some 8%, I think. And you have those who were murdered by Poles and by Ukrainians and by others. So it is not only a German enterprise, it was a German-led enterprise, but it's not only a German enterprise. So what was the reason for them to join this project? But nowadays we speak about a European enterprise. Right? Not in all countries they like it. And one of the major battlegrounds is in Poland today, and you definitely have heard about all kinds of cases where the Polish current government doesn't like what scholars bring forth, but that's part of the issue. Another challenge that emerged in this period, and that is the challenge of genocide scholarship. So actually, as we also heard from Joel before, the term genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin, actually in 1943 and published in 1944. He had contemplated on a concept already before, because in the 1930s, relating to the Armenian genocide. Of course, he fled Poland and got to the United States, became their professor in Chicago, and as a lawyer, so he coined this term in order to have it used for future occasions to fight genocide. Right? And the term was embraced immediately already in the Nuremberg trials, and later on it led to a convention on the prevention of genocide in December 1948. But for several decades, genocide scholarship focused on the Holocaust. Only since the end of the 1970s, the main or this approach broadened and started to look at other cases, and it became very dominant. Up till the moment that nowadays, and I'm sure that you're all aware of that, in most places people will speak about Holocaust and genocide studies together in one breath, right? And the question is if that is right. I'll come back to it in a moment. But there is even within this, you can find political influences, and that is something that Charles is very much interested in, that there are genocide scholars who don't like the Holocaust. And there is an interesting overview of genocide studies from 2011 where Colin Tetz, an Australian genocide scholar, said that, that genocide scholars should relate to the Holocaust with some comfort, right? As I say, and not seeing it as a rival or an enemy, right? So he encountered in the camp of genocide scholars an enmity towards the Holocaust, as if the Holocaust is taking over or is the leading case, and that is wrong. So this became a challenge, although no doubt that there are a lot of things that are comparable and should be seen through the methodology of genocide studies. But what I would say is that if we look now also about intentionalism, functionalism, Kershaw, Hilberg, and other studies, with all the debates between them, there is one thing that holds them together, and that is that for all of them, they were looking for the path leading to the final solution. Right? How could it happen? Well, it's the title of one of the books. How did it evolve? Why? And so on. So this is a tunnel look on what happened. Right? Interestingly, this led that there's a lot of research on the period leading to the final solution until the moment that there is a final solution in 1942. On the period afterwards, we have lesser research, right? But there is another thing, and when we look at the enormous output of scholarship since 1990, we can see that there are a lot of things that were carried out, anti-Jewish policies that were carried out and did not lead in any way to the final solution. And what happened with mainstream historians who were interested in the final solution, they sometimes by force take certain developments as if they were leading to the final solution. Right? So for instance, Jewish councils, Judenräte, were initially not established for the purpose of a final solution. Right? This was a concept that emerged in a department where Eichmann worked. He was not yet the head of it in 1937. It was a way to control the Jews instead of conducting policies towards individual Jews. What they said, we shouldn't deal with all the different Jews in the different organizations. Should be one, what I call a headship, that controls all the Jews, and we'll give them orders and we'll conduct with them. But this didn't have to do anything with the final solution. They didn't think about it before. So there are a lot of things that happen which are not related to the final solution. For instance, 1934, the German Language Association embarks on a campaign to de-Judaize the German language. What does it mean? Okay. And there is an attempt to de-Judaize the German legal system, but not just from Jewish people, but from Jewish ideas. And you have in the arts, and in music, and in medicine. Medicine is an enormous field in all fields of medicine. So what you can see, and that is what a lot of studies have shown in the recent period and not before, is that that a lot of professionals in different areas tried to implement anti-Jewish policies, even if they were not ordered to do so, according to their understanding of what should be done. Right? There are also orders, there are also policies, but a lot is being done before there were orders or without orders. Right? So what we can see now is that the anti-Jewish policies went into different directions. Right? Now, according to Jewish, Christian, and humanist understanding, the ultimate evil of the Nazi period is the genocide of the Jews, the murder. But was that really also the goal of the Nazis? So now what we can see is there are a lot of documents which the scholars didn't use the right glasses to read them. You find the expression of the Jüdischen Geist, the Jewish spirit. There is a Jewish spirit which has penetrated the whole world, economics, political thinking, and so on. And what is the Jewish spirit, according to them? That is the idea of human equality. And the idea of human equality, which you find in capitalism, in communism, in democracy, in liberalism, and so on, that is all originating from the Jews. Why? Because what we have now, that is in the Nazi period, that is what we got from the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment took it over from Christianity. Christianity took it over from Judaism, right? From Judaism. And Judaism started this idea that the world was created from one person, Adam. And all descendants, all the people in the world, in humankind, are descendants of one person, so they are equal. And Hitler says in 1933, taking over Germany, is an answer to 1989, that is the French Revolution. So when he says the Jewish idea, he and not he and he only, that is the idea of equality. And therefore the Nazi enterprise was apocalyptic and was intended to be global. It was expanding all over the period and visioning even going beyond according to the achievements. But basically, this is something that was an apocalyptic view, that now at this moment in the 1930s we can do something that was impossible before. And therefore it is, and therefore also in his in Hitler's will, before he commits suicide in 1945 in a bunker, he speaks about this. So, El Shaddai, where are you? The handouts?
And also, finish in a few minutes, we can take
No,
some
I'm
questions.
finishing now.
Okay, we'll take
Okay,
some questions.
a long finish, but it is a finish.
Bringing it. It was prepared for the second lecture, so they're bringing it.
Okay, it's for no, but what do I see? So what I say that we can redefine, I suggest a redefinition of the Holocaust, and I would say that I call myself a neo-intentionalist, but saying that the intention was different than what was assumed by the first intentionalist. The first intentionalist thought about the final solution as the intention. And what I say is that the vision that we can see from this expression by Hitler in 1919 of total removal of the Jews, and afterwards also in Mein Kampf, the Jewish spirit and what the Jews mean. And Jews are the carriers of an evil idea. So the Jews have to be exorcised, but also the idea to be exorcised. Right? And the ideas were carried over by Bolshevism. It's not only Jews, and also others, right? So it is in the literature, it is in the medicine, it is in the physics, and so on. So we have to purify all domains of life, and this is the overall view, Nazi view, right? The genocide is a main chapter of this, but it's not the only one, and we can see that next to the murder, a lot of other things still go on. It is not that when the chapter of the genocide arrives, all other things are disregarded or are not dealt with anymore, right? Economic issues and our artistic issues and so on. So the idea and the goal as seen from the Nazi perspective, and that is important, not from our perspective, right? went beyond the murder as such, because the Jews were, and the Jewish idea were something that polluted the world, according to their understanding. And tomorrow we'll talk about anti-Semitism, the term and so on, but if we connect to what Yoel Kotek said before, this has to do with the idea that that we see in the history of anti-Semitism, in that Jews represent a principle, an idea. It was for Christianity, it was one thing. For in the Enlightenment with Voltaire, the Jews are the principle of not being able to to go forward. And then in socialism, Jews were capitalists, and for capitalist Jews were communists, and so Jews represent a principle, principle idea, and this is now transformed in the Nazi period to the Jews standing behind a global evil, and this is expressed in several documents where leading Nazi scholars and politicians or leaders say that we'll need to continue beyond the borders of Europe, also to other places, because the world has to be purified from the Jewish spirit. So, is there I have a proposal for a redefinition of the Holocaust, and I asked to have a handout for you. And should I run? We can wait for it, and in the meantime, start with Q&A when it will come. That will be the what is it? The topping of the ice cream afterwards. Yeah.
So thank you very much. So any questions?
So is there today an accepted or leading school of thought between the intentionalists, the functionalists, or are they still debating? If you pick up one book, you're going to get one perspective. If you pick up another book, you're going to get another perspective. Is there one that's deemed right?
Well, that scholarship always goes on in debating, right? Otherwise, you don't write a new study. You debate with somebody else. And you say when you pick up a book, always look at the date of publication, right? So the books are there, and it depends on how you what you use, what you can find in your library, and so on. But scholarship is dynamic, and I think it is accumulating, right? And of course there are different views, and you can see people who tend more to functionalism. My good late friend David Cesarani, in his book Final Solution, was more of a going into the functionalist direction, but they don't. Nowadays, nobody disregards Hitler anymore, right? So there was a period that said Hitler was not so important, right? It was done, and it was taken up by David Irving, for instance, saying, and the well-known debate and trial and so on. But I think it's accepted nowadays that Hitler was central, but his vision was vague. He didn't know exactly what to do. He had this general vision, and it are the people on the ground who translate this according to their understanding. Everyone with his profession or her professionalism, right? And therefore, you have in the field of medicine a racist who try to implement it there, and you have in the field of arts others, and so on, and they are not working together, but they all do it in a very short period. re-emphasized the issue that we are talking about 12 years and 98 days, right? So, you know how long you wait for a response from what is it? What example shall we give from? If you apply to a ministry or something, you want an answer. You get an answer after 3 months, 4 months, and so on. Right? Here, things happened in a pace that is unbelievable, right? So, and people were running forward. And by the way, another study which was very interesting by Michael Wild, a German. He showed his second PhD was about some 220 SS officers, and he checked their backgrounds and also how they functioned. And what emerged was that, counter to what we tend to think about Germans, that Germans are very orderly and they follow orders and so on. No, what he showed is that the authorities told these people, right, you can go forward as long as it serves the regime, right? So, and we give you a backing. Without any law or something, you can do it. And that is what actually happens on the ground. That is regarding SS officers, but you have it also with many others. Okay.
Question. What scholarship do you think still needs to be done or accomplished? I know that's probably a loaded question, but what areas do you think really need to be studied now?
There are a lot of things. First of all, most of the countries of Southeastern Europe are not well researched. Bulgaria, for instance, Greece, and so on. But there are also other approaches to older concepts and conceptualizations. Right? I myself wrote a study about the ghettos. Right? Why? Because at Yad Vashem we decided to publish an encyclopedia of the ghettos. And okay, when you plan the publication of a book, you want to know how many people should be involved, how much money it will cost, what is the budget, and so on. So the question is, how many ghettos were there? That is, I'm talking about 2003. Nobody knew how many ghettos there were. Nobody knew. In some studies there were 700, 400, 2,000. Just scholars had written for 60 years after the end of World War II, right? And then, where's the order for the establishment of ghettos? Most of the scholarship relates to a certain document where it is not written, if you read it, right? So suddenly we had to rethink the issue of what was the ghetto in the Nazi eyes, right? And so, for instance, I bumped, or not so much bumped, but I had in my library a book that I inherited from my father, a book that was published in 1938, a scholarly study by Peter Heinz Serafim, a German professor, who used a lot of Jewish scholarship, and it's called The Jews in the Eastern European domain, right? And there you have a lot about ghettos. The ghettos in 1938, and he brings maps of ghettos. You have a map of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1938, not 1939 or 1940, right? Because the term ghetto, and that is something that you all know, is actually originated in Venice in the 16th century and then was used all over in various ways and so on. And it was actually a Jewish neighborhood. So what happened is that there was never an order to establish ghettos, a central order. But when when Poland was invaded, they encountered ghettos. And they said, okay, then were local commanders who said, well, we have to close them or so and so. So there is something that emerges. But if you read Hilberg, this is intentional and it is part of the concentration stage and so on. So suddenly, after 60 years, we had to rethink something that we thought that we knew, and which I thought also in the decades before, right? And you have many more of these issues. So there are things that we have to rethink. Right? Of course, there are also new methodologies in history, and I mentioned them, spatial and so on. So there is, I don't know if you know the name, Robert Jan van Pelt. He is a Dutch-born Canadian scholar who was involved. He wrote about Auschwitz, and he was involved in the Irving Lipstadt trial. Right? He writes now a study of the history of barracks. Barracks became a tool for dictatorships, right? But it didn't start that way. So you can go into many directions, and yeah. So what I wanted to do before we can continue the Q&A afterwards, but I gave you a redefinition of the Holocaust, which I propose. So the Holocaust or Shoah are the commonly used terms for the apocalyptic anti-Jewish campaign, and they emphasize 1933, 1945, because you have scholars who start the Holocaust in 1939 or 1941 or 1935 and so on, but the whole period unleashed by Nazi Germany under its transformative leader Adolf Hitler. Transformative. You can go into sociological research, what it means also. It sought to exercise the Jewish spirit, the Jüdischen Geist, the principle that taught the idea of human equality, which was viewed as undermining the essentials of human existence, versus the hierarchy of nature, right? And its racial carriers, the physical Jews, as defined by the perpetrators. That's also important because there were also non-Jews who were defined as Jews. And so on. In Eastern Europe, by the way, what happened is that the Nazis not always could, not always knew who was a Jew, and they relied on locals. And then locals who wanted to settle accounts with their neighbors said, he is a Jew, right? And the people were called. Okay, so physical Jews from all spheres of life. This first in Germany, then in the entire European continent, and ultimately across the globe. It was implemented and supported by a broad variety of social, national, and administrative groups within and outside Germany, encompassing a vast number of people and German allied governments, some of them having additional local considerations. Eliminating the arch-enemy, the Jewish spirit, and its Jewish purveyors would allow for the creation of a utopian new world based on the hierarchy of nature regarding races and peoples. This campaign, implemented through a variety of means, was largely successful despite the brief period of Nazi Germany's existence, just 12 years and 98 days, due to the creativity, energy, and determination of all the devoted and enlisted participants. The Holocaust was a project that sought to change the world, and its genocidal chapter, which interplays with Nazi empire building, war goals and war results, ethnic cleansings of several other groups, and the elimination of lives unworthy of life, cost the lives of close to 6 million Jews. According to the estimations, it is between 5.6 and 5.9. Jews responded actively to this campaign. The Jewish responses had been conditioned by long-durée developments in Jewish history that preceded the Nazi period. The behavior of non-German, non-Jewish actors vis-à-vis this campaign stretched across a broad array of attitudes and is part and parcel of the event. The disastrous results of the Holocaust in general and its varying results in different settings in particular are also due to this essential component. Altogether, the Holocaust laid the 2,000 years of European Jewish existence almost entirely to ruins, affected North African Jewry too, and shattered to a large extent the foundations of Western culture. So that is a short definition. Short definitions you will find in encyclopedias and so on, but they are not sufficient. So in order to be accurate, you have to give something which is a little bit longer. Yes.
Yeah, no, I find that last thing absolutely fascinating, because so many times when we talk about World War II, when we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about Nazi war aims and the Holocaust as if they were completely two separate dimensions. And if I understand what you're saying that the long-term goal of world domination, or at least European domination, required the Holocaust. In other words, the Holocaust was a necessary thing if Germany was going to be able to sustain its war goals, which is that of having a racial hierarchy across all of Europe.
But right, but it developed over time. You know, so it's very important to think about, look upon our own behavior, right? So when you advance in a certain process, you see more options, you think how to implement. So there is a certain beginning, there is a vague idea, and then over time, and with the successes during the war, for instance, it allowed for going further, right, and implementing other things, and this interacts with the suggestions that come from below, right, and that is important. So again, also in 1941, when Hitler speaks, there is his of course, his I would say fundamental speech on the 30th of January 1939. That if there will be a war, the result will not be Bolshevization and so, but it's the extermination, and he uses the term extermination of the Jews in Europe, right? But when they enter North Africa, and we know there is this unit by Walter Rauf, which was first intended to accompany Rommel to Palestine, and after Alamein is sent to Tunisia, and he started to work in Tunisia, and exactly the same method that he did in Eastern Europe, right? And we have other examples. So it is evolving, and that is very important to think about. So we try to put it in a box as it is something very clear, but it is evolving, right? But there is a basic drive, and that is important.
Yeah, but the evolution also makes sense, because once you have the conquest, then your next thing is how to sustain this conquest. And in order to sustain the conquest, you need to eliminate ideological as well as physical opponents.
Yeah.
And that, I think, comes out of your argument.
Right, yeah.
Professor, do you believe that every aspect of the Holocaust was covered? If not, what's missing?
Is every aspect was
Of the Holocaust was covered
in research?
in research.
Okay.
If not, what's missing?
It's actually the same question. You never know, right, in research what is missing until somebody say. There is a very interesting German scholar, Götz Ali, who every 2 years write a new book, a monocausal explanation of the Holocaust, right? So, and he's done marvelous work. So we don't agree with all what he says, but he goes always to new archives and then find things that you never thought about, right? So there are, and definitely there are also things that are clear that were not covered, and that especially regarding certain.
I'll give you an example. Apropos of what you're saying, the historian to your right, Mr. Marcus. If you go to the Times of Israel, it's just hot off the press. The Times of Israel just did an article on the work that Marcus did on concentration camps in the United Kingdom, which is a new chapter on uncovering the history of the Holocaust.
I'm in your shadow.
Yeah, yeah. So
Okay,
it's
also
it's in the Times of Israel now. It was just released.
yeah,
Very
but
important.
what we say, look, it is so enormous. It is covering all over Europe and beyond, right? That when you go to the grassroots level, and you ask the question who participated, for instance, right? Then there is so much to do because in every place the police, local police was involved. So research on the local police is important, right? And you have now, seen in the past decade, I think several tenths of studies on police in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and so on. And then something new comes up, and suddenly, okay, you see that was missing. We didn't know before, because we are shaped by our own raising, I would say, and but the important thing is, of course, that we are in the modern period, and the documentation is enormous. A lot was done orally, yeah, a lot was done orally, but a lot was documented. Look, the Yad Vashem archive has now 220 million pages of documents, right? And some 50,000 interviews, and so, and photos, and so on. So, if you ask what is new in recent years, analysis of photographs, right, is becoming very important. What you can learn from it, and so on. So there is still so much to do. And so if you're interested in a PhD in it, I can help you.
Okay, so on that note, on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much, Dan, for your presentation.